The cotton sack split open at dawn on August 14, 1852, and what spilled across the Texas soil wasn't the white bolls overseer Mackenzie Knight had demanded, but his own suffocated body, buried beneath the very crop he'd whipped a man for refusing to pick. Joseph Taylor's hands were still stained with blood and cotton fiber as the plantation bell rang out across Blackwood Fields. This is the story of a brutality so extreme that it transformed an enslaved man into an instrument of calculated vengeance. A reckoning that turned the symbol of oppression into a burial shroud and proved that even the most broken human spirit could strike back when pushed beyond the threshold of endurance. What emerged from that cotton storage barn would expose the savage reality of plantation justice and reveal how far one man would go when the choice became simple: die as a victim or survive as something far more dangerous. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun burned red over Blackwood Fields plantation when the foreman discovered what Joseph Taylor had done with overseer Mackenzie Knight's body. The cotton storage barn stood silent as a tomb, its massive doors thrown open to reveal bales stacked in patterns that defied explanation, until someone noticed the dark stains seeping through white fiber that should have been pristine. Knight's disappearance had been noted 3 days earlier, but plantation owner Miles Abbott had assumed his notoriously cruel overseer had ridden into town for one of his violent drinking sessions that sometimes lasted days. The discovery of his body buried within thousands of pounds of cotton transformed assumptions into horror that would ripple through every plantation in eastern Texas. Joseph Taylor had vanished the same night Knight disappeared, his absence from the slave quarters noticed but not immediately connected to the overseer's fate. The two events had seemed unrelated until Abbott's foreman began dismantling the suspiciously arranged cotton bales and found Knight's suffocated corpse, wrapped in the same material he'd spent years forcing enslaved people to harvest under threat of brutal punishment. The body's position suggested prolonged suffering rather than quick death. Knight had been buried alive within the cotton, his mouth and airways packed with fiber that prevented screaming while allowing just enough air to prolong his awareness of approaching death. The method mirrored punishments Knight himself had devised for enslaved workers who failed to meet his impossible quotas. Blackwood Fields sprawled across 3,000 acres of prime cotton-growing land in eastern Texas, its operations dependent on the labor of 187 enslaved people who worked from dawn until darkness under conditions that made neighboring plantations seem almost humane by comparison. Miles Abbott had purchased the property in 1847 with inherited wealth from his merchant father, bringing with him ambitions of becoming the region's most profitable cotton producer regardless of human cost. Abbott's management philosophy centered on maximum extraction of labor through systematic brutality that he justified as necessary discipline for maintaining productivity. His selection of Mackenzie Knight as head overseer had been deliberate, choosing a man whose reputation for cruelty exceeded even the harsh standards common to Texas plantation operations in 1852. Knight had arrived at Blackwood Fields in 1849 after being dismissed from a Louisiana plantation where his methods had resulted in deaths that even tolerance owners found excessive. His expertise in breaking human spirits through calculated torture had appealed to Abbott's belief that fear was the most efficient tool for managing enslaved labor. The overseer's signature punishment involved extended whipping sessions combined with forced labor that pushed victims beyond physical collapse. Those who failed to meet cotton-picking quotas faced beatings that left permanent scars, followed by increased quotas that made future punishment inevitable. The system created cycles of suffering designed to destroy hope while extracting maximum work from bodies that were viewed as disposable resources. Joseph Taylor had endured 3 years under Knight's supervision, watching the overseer's methods claim lives while plantation records attributed deaths to natural causes or accidents that absolved management of responsibility. His wife Hannah had died during childbirth in the slave quarters after being denied medical care that might have saved her life, a loss that Knight had dismissed as economically insignificant since her labor value had been declining. The whipping that precipitated Knight's murder had occurred on August 11th when Joseph's cotton sack came up 15 pounds short of the 200-pound daily quota that Knight had recently increased, without regard for the physical impossibility of meeting such demands during the hottest part of the Texas summer. The punishment had been savage even by Knight's standards, leaving Joseph's back shredded and infected. But something had changed during that whipping session. Witnesses later reported that Joseph's screams had stopped abruptly, replaced by silence that seemed more frightening than the sounds of agony that typically accompanied Knight's punishments. The overseer had interpreted the silence as submission, not recognizing it as the moment when survival instinct transformed into calculated determination for revenge. Plantation Disciplinary Records, August 11, 1852. Enslaved worker Joseph Taylor received corrective punishment for quota deficiency. 40 lashes administered. Worker returned to quarters for recovery before resuming duties. The 3 days between the whipping and Knight's discovery had been carefully planned rather than impulsive violence. Joseph had used his time in the quarters to study Knight's patterns, identify vulnerabilities, and develop a method of revenge that would reflect the poetic justice of using the plantation's primary crop as instrument of the overseer's destruction. Knight's routine included late-night inspections of the cotton storage barn, where he would inventory the day's harvest and ensure that no theft or sabotage had occurred during evening hours. His predictability had made him vulnerable to anyone desperate enough to exploit the brief window when he was alone and isolated from other plantation staff who might intervene. The attack had been swift and efficient, suggesting planning that contradicted assumptions about enslaved people lacking capacity for sophisticated violence against their oppressors. Joseph had used tools from the gin house to disable Knight without killing him immediately, then transported his bound body to the storage barn, where the final punishment would unfold over hours rather than minutes. The cotton itself became the murder weapon, packed around Knight's body with methodical precision that ensured slow suffocation while preventing escape. Joseph had arranged the bales to appear normal from external inspection, creating a tomb that would preserve the body while allowing it to be discovered eventually, as testament to what happened when brutality pushed someone beyond the point where death seemed preferable to continued submission. The discovery had triggered immediate manhunt for Joseph, whose escape from the plantation had been accomplished with same careful planning that characterized Knight's murder. He had vanished into the Texas wilderness, carrying nothing but stolen supplies and knowledge that his actions had guaranteed either freedom or execution, with no middle ground possible. Miles Abbott's response revealed the economic calculations that governed plantation justice more than any moral considerations about the murder itself. His primary concern focused on preventing the incident from inspiring similar acts of resistance among other enslaved workers who might interpret Joseph's actions as proof that overseers were not invincible. The plantation owner had immediately dispatched riders to neighboring properties with warnings about a dangerous fugitive, carefully framing the narrative to emphasize Joseph's supposed madness, rather than acknowledging legitimate grievances that might resonate with enslaved people throughout the region. The characterization served to isolate the incident as aberration rather than symptom of systematic brutality. But whispers had already spread through the slave quarters at Blackwood Fields and beyond, carrying a message that terrified plantation owners more than any individual act of violence. Joseph Taylor had proven that even the most feared overseer could be killed, and that cotton, which symbolized their oppression, could become a weapon against those who wielded the whip. Blackwood Fields had established its reputation as one of eastern Texas's most productive cotton operations, through methods that neighboring plantation owners privately acknowledged as excessive while publicly praising Abbott's impressive yields. The property's layout reflected systematic efficiency, designed to maximize control over enslaved workers whose lives were measured entirely by their contribution to cotton production. The main plantation house stood atop a gradual rise overlooking fields that stretched toward the horizon in carefully maintained rows that represented Abbott's obsession with order and productivity. The structure's Greek Revival architecture projected wealth and permanence, its white columns and broad porches creating visual statements about power that were intended to intimidate rather than welcome. The enslaved quarters occupied low ground near the cotton processing facilities, their crude wooden structures arranged in rows that facilitated surveillance and prevented private gatherings that might foster resistance. The buildings lacked adequate ventilation, weatherproofing, or sanitation, their conditions reflecting Abbott's calculation that minimal investment in worker housing freed capital for land acquisition and equipment purchases. Between the main house and the quarters stood the operational heart of Blackwood Fields, the cotton gin, processing facilities, storage barns, and overseer's cabin that formed the infrastructure of plantation economy, These buildings received maintenance and improvements that were never extended to enslaved housing, their relative quality illustrating the hierarchy that valued crops and equipment above human welfare. The daily rhythm of plantation life followed patterns established through decades of agricultural slavery, with routines designed to extract maximum labor while preventing the formation of relationships or activities that might threaten management control. Enslaved workers rose before dawn to the sound of bells that regulated every aspect of their existence from waking through sleeping. Morning meals consisted of minimal rations calculated to provide sufficient calories for field work without wasting resources on nutrition beyond basic survival requirements. The food quality at Blackwood Fields was notably poor, even by the standards of institutions designed to minimize costs associated with maintaining enslaved populations. Work assignments were distributed by Knight and his assistant overseers according to classifications that divided enslaved workers into categories based on age, physical capability, and perceived reliability. The system created internal hierarchies that Abbott believed would prevent unified resistance by giving some workers slightly better treatment in exchange for monitoring their peers. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Field hands formed the largest category, their days spent in brutal labor that varied by season but never decreased in intensity. Cotton planting, cultivation, and harvest required different skills but equal endurance, with quotas adjusted to ensure that workers operated at maximum capacity regardless of weather conditions or individual physical limitations. Joseph Taylor had been classified as a prime field hand since his arrival at Blackwood Fields in 1849. Purchased at auction in Houston along with his wife Hannah as part of Abbott's expansion of operations. His previous experience on a smaller plantation in Mississippi had taught him cotton cultivation skills that made him valuable despite his quiet demeanor that some overseers mistook for lack of spirit. Hannah's assignment to domestic duties in the main house had initially seemed fortunate, offering lighter physical demands and better food than field workers received. But the position had exposed her to different forms of cruelty, including Miles Abbott's wife Evelyn Thomas, whose casual violence toward enslaved women reflected both jealousy and the sadistic tendencies that prosperity and unchecked power can nurture. The couple's 3 years at Blackwood Fields had been marked by systematic degradation that wore away at their humanity while somehow failing to destroy the core of resistance that Joseph carried silently through each day of forced labor. His ability to endure without breaking had made him valuable to plantation operations while marking him as potential threat to overseers who understood that silence could indicate strength rather than submission. Knight's management style combined physical brutality with psychological warfare designed to break spirits before breaking bodies. His morning inspections of the slave quarters included random searches for contraband, unauthorized possessions, or evidence of activities that might indicate independent thinking. The searches served no practical purpose beyond establishing dominance and preventing enslaved workers from maintaining any sense of privacy or personal dignity. Plantation Management Log Miles Abbott, June 1852. Current operations proceeding efficiently under Knight's supervision. Cotton yields projected to exceed previous season by 18%. Disciplinary incidents remain within acceptable ranges. Recommend continued investment in land acquisition using profits from increased production. The whipping post stood near the cotton gin, where all enslaved workers would witness punishments administered to those who failed to meet quotas or violated regulations that governed every aspect of their existence. The post's prominent placement was intentional, designed to create constant reminder of consequences for resistance or inadequate performance. Knight's punishments followed theatrical patterns that transformed discipline into public spectacle, designed to terrorize audiences while satisfying his own sadistic impulses. His whipping technique had been refined through years of practice, calibrated to inflict maximum pain while avoiding damage that might reduce worker productivity beyond the recovery period he deemed acceptable. The overseer's weapons included multiple whips designed for different purposes: lighter implements for routine discipline, heavier versions for serious violations, and specialized tools that left distinctive scar patterns Knight used to mark persistent offenders. His collection represented professional approach to brutality that distinguished systematic cruelty from random violence. Joseph had witnessed dozens of whipping sessions during his time at Blackwood Fields, each one reinforcing lessons about the costs of resistance, while somehow failing to extinguish the spark of defiance that Knight's methods were designed to eliminate. The overseer's mistake was assuming that silence indicated successful conditioning rather than careful concealment of fury that was accumulating toward inevitable expression. Hannah's death in March 1852 had transformed Joseph's silent endurance into something more dangerous, though Knight failed to recognize the change. The loss had occurred during childbirth in the quarters when complications arose that required medical intervention. Abbott refused to authorize for enslaved women whose labor value didn't justify expenditure on doctors who charged fees that cut into profit margins. Joseph had held his dying wife while Knight stood outside the quarters cabin, unmoved by screams that eventually faded into silence that marked both Hannah's death and the moment when Joseph's relationship with his own mortality fundamentally changed. A man with nothing left to lose becomes capable of actions that were previously unthinkable. The months following Hannah's death had been marked by Joseph's apparent increased compliance with Knight's demands, his cotton quotas consistently met, despite the emotional devastation that should have reduced his productivity. The overseer had interpreted this performance as evidence that Hannah's death had finally broken Joseph's spirit and transformed him into the ideal enslaved worker, efficient, obedient, and psychologically destroyed. But Joseph's improved performance reflected different motivation, a conscious decision to avoid drawing attention while he observed Knight's patterns and planned responses to brutality that would eventually exceed his capacity for silent endurance. The August whipping would provide both justification and opportunity for actions that had been forming in his mind since the night Hannah died in his arms, while an overseer stood outside, calculating whether her death would impact the next day's cotton harvest. The weeks following Hannah's death had revealed subtle changes in Joseph's behavior that should have alerted Knight to dangerous developments occurring beneath the surface of apparent compliance. But the overseer's arrogance prevented him from recognizing that his most reliable field hand was transforming into his most determined enemy. Other enslaved workers at Blackwood Fields had begun noticing Joseph's late-night movements, his unexplained absences from the quarters during hours when exhaustion should have kept everyone motionless in their bunks. The observations were never reported to overseers, because unwritten codes governing survival in enslaved communities required protecting members from management scrutiny regardless of what they might be planning. Abigail Anderson, an elderly woman who'd survived 4 decades of slavery across multiple plantations, had been the first to recognize that Joseph's nighttime activities suggested planning rather than grief-driven wandering. Her experience had taught her to identify the signs of someone preparing for actions that would either result in freedom or death, with no middle ground between those outcomes. She'd approached Joseph one evening in late July, speaking quietly while other workers pretended not to notice the conversation. Her words had been carefully chosen to offer warning without demanding explanation. Whatever you're planning, make sure it's worth what comes after. They'll make examples that last generations. Joseph's response had been equally careful, acknowledging her concern without confirming suspicions about his intentions. But his eyes had revealed determination that made further warnings unnecessary. Abigail had recognized the look from previous encounters with enslaved people, who'd reached points where survival required actions that would horrify those who'd never experienced systematic dehumanization. The old woman had survived by developing sophisticated understanding of power dynamics on plantations, recognizing when to submit and when small acts of resistance might succeed without triggering disproportionate retaliation. Her longevity testified to wisdom that Joseph seemed determined to ignore in favor of responses that prioritized justice over survival. Observations recorded in Abigail Anderson's memory, shared years later, Joseph stopped talking about tomorrow like there would be one. That's when I knew he was planning something that didn't include living through it. Man who expects to die becomes capable of things that terrify people who still got hope. Knight's behavior during July and early August had grown increasingly erratic, his punishments more frequent and severe, without corresponding increases in actual disciplinary problems. The escalation suggested psychological deterioration that plantation management either failed to notice or chose to ignore, because Knight's methods continued producing impressive cotton yields that justified Abbott's investment in his services. The overseer had developed obsession with Joseph specifically, singling him out for additional scrutiny despite his consistent performance meeting all quota requirements. The attention seemed to reflect Knight's unconscious recognition that something about Joseph threatened his authority in ways he couldn't articulate but instinctively feared. Minor infractions that Knight would normally have ignored when committed by other workers resulted in harsh punishments when Joseph was involved. A cotton sack with loose stitching, a water break that extended 30 seconds beyond permitted time, a glance that Knight interpreted as insolent, all became justifications for discipline that revealed the overseer's need to establish dominance over someone whose submission felt incomplete. Other overseers at Blackwood Fields had begun commenting privately about Knight's fixation, questioning whether his attention to Joseph was serving productive purposes or reflecting personal vendetta that might eventually interfere with operations. But none felt comfortable challenging the head overseer whose authority derived directly from Miles Abbott's confidence in his methods. The plantation owner had dismissed concerns about Knight's increasing severity, interpreting the escalating punishments as appropriate responses to defiance that required suppression before it could inspire broader resistance. Abbott's management philosophy held that excessive discipline was always preferable to insufficient control, making him receptive to Knight's justifications regardless of their validity. The incident that directly precipitated the August 11th whipping had been manufactured by Knight rather than resulting from actual failure on Joseph's part. The overseer had secretly removed cotton from Joseph's sack during weighing, creating the quota deficiency that justified punishment he'd been planning regardless of actual performance. Several enslaved workers had witnessed Knight's manipulation but understood that reporting it would result in their own punishment for presuming to question overseer integrity. The observation had been shared quietly through the quarters, building resentment that created dangerous potential for collective action if circumstances ever provided opportunity. Ryan Robinson, a field hand who'd arrived at Blackwood Fields shortly after Joseph, had been positioned near the weighing station when Knight removed the cotton. His account of the incident, whispered to trusted workers that evening, revealed the calculated nature of Knight's persecution and suggested that the overseer's hostility toward Joseph reflected something beyond normal plantation discipline. The theft of cotton from Joseph's sack had been witnessed by 3 other workers, whose consistent accounts left no doubt about Knight's deliberate creation of the quota deficiency. Their testimony, shared only within the enslaved community, transformed the subsequent whipping from punishment for legitimate failure into naked aggression that even slavery's brutal logic couldn't justify. Testimony shared among enslaved workers, August 11, 1852, Knight took maybe 20 pounds from Joseph's sack while pretending to check the weight. "We all seen it but couldn't say nothing because overseer's word against ours means another whipping for whoever speaks up." That beating wasn't about cotton, it was about Knight needing to break someone who wouldn't break. The whipping itself had been conducted with Knight's usual theatrical cruelty, his commentary during the punishment designed to humiliate Joseph while reinforcing lessons about the consequences of inadequate performance. But something about Joseph's response had been different from previous victims, a quality that several observers found disturbing in ways they couldn't immediately explain. How most people subjected to Knight's whippings produced screams that eventually deteriorated into pleading or incoherent sounds that satisfied the overseer's need for submission. Joseph's screams had stopped after the 20th lash, replaced by silence that felt more threatening than sounds of agony. Knight had continued the punishment past his usual stopping point, apparently frustrated by Joseph's refusal to provide the verbal surrender that typically concluded whipping sessions. The extended beating had left Joseph's back destroyed beyond normal parameters, suggesting that the overseer had lost control in ways that undermined his carefully cultivated image of disciplined cruelty. When the whipping finally ended, Joseph had walked back to the quarters without assistance, his steady gait contradicting the severity of injuries that should have left him collapsed. The display had been noted by everyone present, creating ripples of speculation about what kind of man could absorb that level of punishment and still move with dignity intact. Abigail had been waiting at the quarters when Joseph arrived, her preparations for treating his wounds already complete, despite her knowledge that interference with punishment consequences could result in her own discipline. She'd worked on his destroyed back for hours, her healing knowledge accumulated across decades of treating injuries that plantation management preferred to ignore. During the treatment, Joseph had spoken only once, his voice steady despite pain that should have made coherent speech impossible. His words had been simple but loaded with meaning that Abigail immediately understood. 3 days, then things change. The old woman had asked no questions, recognizing that Joseph's statement wasn't invitation for discussion but notification of decisions already made. She'd finished treating his wounds in silence, understanding that she was preparing someone for actions that would either transform him into legend or make him cautionary tale about the costs of resistance. Knight's behavior following the whipping had revealed either remarkable stupidity or pathological inability to recognize danger. He'd continued his normal routines without additional security precautions, apparently confident that his brutality had reinforced rather than undermined his authority over someone who'd just absorbed punishment that would have killed weaker men. The cotton storage barn stood silent on the night of August 13th when Mackenzie Knight conducted his routine inventory inspection, unaware that Joseph Taylor had been waiting in the shadows for 3 days, his wounded back still seeping blood through bandages that Abigail had changed that morning with prayers she hoped might protect a man determined to die for justice. Knight's lantern cast dancing shadows across bales stacked floor to ceiling, the light revealing the wealth that Blackwood Fields extracted from enslaved bodies that were discarded when they could no longer produce profits that justified the minimal costs of keeping them alive. The overseer's footsteps echoed in the cavernous space as he moved between rows, checking for moisture damage or theft that might reduce the value of cotton awaiting transport to market. Joseph had positioned himself near the loading door, where mechanical advantage would compensate for his weakened physical condition. The iron hook used for moving heavy bales hung within reach, its weight and leverage transforming it into a weapon capable of neutralizing Knight's size advantage during the crucial initial moments of confrontation. The attack came without warning as Knight passed the loading area, the iron hook striking his skull with force calculated to disable without immediately killing. Joseph had spent 3 days planning this moment, visualizing every movement required to transform himself from victim into executioner of the man who destroyed his life, through systematic cruelty that exceeded even slavery's brutal norms. Knight collapsed among the cotton bales, his lantern falling and extinguishing in a shower of sparks that briefly illuminated Joseph standing over him with the hook still gripped in hands that had picked millions of pounds of cotton under threat of the whip this overseer wielded with such pleasure. The darkness that followed seemed appropriate for what was about to unfold in this temple of forced labor. Joseph worked quickly despite his injuries, using rope from the gin house to bind Knight's hands and feet with knots learned during years of securing cotton bales for transport. The overseer regained consciousness to find himself immobilized, his attempts to call for help muffled by cotton fiber Joseph had packed into his mouth with methodical precision. The lantern was relit, its glow revealing Knight's face transforming through stages of confusion, recognition, and finally terror as he understood both his situation and the identity of his captor. Joseph watched these emotional transitions with the same detachment Knight had shown while administering punishments that destroyed bodies and spirits with equal efficiency. Joseph's voice when he finally spoke carried none of the screaming that typically accompanied whipping sessions, his tone conversational as he explained what would happen during the hours ahead. "You took my wife. You took my dignity. You took 3 years of my life and turned them into hell that has no name in any language. Now I'm going to take something from you." Knight's muffled protests were ignored as Joseph began the careful process of constructing the cotton tomb that would serve as both execution chamber and monument to poetic justice. The bales were arranged to create cavity just large enough to contain a human body, their positioning requiring engineering skill that plantation owners never acknowledged their enslaved workers possessed. The construction took hours, Joseph's movements deliberate, despite pain from his wounded back, that would have incapacitated most men. Each bale was placed with consideration for how it would contribute to the overall structure, creating a tomb that would appear normal during casual inspection, while serving its darker purpose of ensuring Knight's slow suffocation. Documentation found years later Joseph's thoughts transcribed from testimony. "I built that tomb the way he built his reputation, one piece of suffering at a time. Every bale I placed was another lash he'd given, another moment of Hannah's death he'd ignored, another piece of humanity he'd tried to steal. The cotton that made Abbott rich would become Knight's grave." Knight was lowered into the cavity while still conscious, his eyes wide with understanding of what Joseph intended. The cotton fiber was packed around his body with the same care Knight had applied to designing punishments, each handful positioned to restrict movement while allowing just enough air to prolong awareness of approaching death. Joseph worked in silence, broken only by Knight's muffled attempts to plead or threaten, sounds that meant nothing to someone who'd already decided that his own death was acceptable price for this justice. The overseer's eyes followed every movement, watching his tomb take shape around him with the dawning realization that he would die as his victims had lived, helpless, terrified, and completely subject to another person's will. The final layer of cotton was applied with particular care, loose enough to allow minimal airflow but dense enough to prevent escape or effective screaming. Joseph arranged the fiber to cover Knight's face while leaving small gaps that would permit breathing for hours or possibly days, depending on factors that were beyond anyone's control once the process began. Additional bales were stacked atop the tomb to create appearance of normal storage, their weight ensuring that even if Knight somehow freed his hands, he would lack leverage to move the hundreds of pounds pressing down on the cotton-packed cavity that had become his coffin. The engineering was sophisticated despite its simplicity, reflecting intelligence that plantation owners insisted enslaved people didn't possess. Joseph stood over the completed tomb. As Knight's muffled sounds gradually weakened, the overseer's initial panic giving way to desperate conservation of oxygen that would only delay the inevitable. The moment held strange peace for Joseph, a sense that some cosmic balance had been partially restored through actions that would be condemned by laws designed to protect people like Knight, while offering no protection to people like Hannah. The barn was restored to apparent normalcy, tools returned to their proper locations, and evidence of struggle eliminated through careful cleaning that revealed Joseph's understanding of how investigations would be conducted if his work was discovered prematurely. He'd created a scene that would confuse initial observers while eventually revealing the truth to anyone who examined it carefully. Before leaving, Joseph retrieved Knight's whip from where it hung in the overseer's cabin, bringing it back to the barn and placing it atop the cotton bales that formed Knight's tomb. The gesture was symbolic rather than practical, a message to whoever discovered the body about the relationship between this death and the systematic cruelty that had preceded it. The plantation bell would ring at dawn in approximately 3 hours, summoning enslaved workers to another day of forced labor under supervision of overseers who would notice Knight's absence without initially understanding its significance. Joseph used those remaining hours to prepare for escape he'd planned with same careful attention he'd applied to constructing Knight's tomb. Supplies stolen over previous weeks were retrieved from hiding places around the plantation, concentrated into a bundle that could be carried during flight through terrain. Joseph had studied during rare moments when his labor took him to Blackwood Fields, boundaries. The provisions were minimal but sufficient for someone who'd spent years surviving on rations designed to maintain life without providing comfort. The escape route led south toward Mexico, where laws against harboring fugitive enslaved people were less vigorously enforced than in Texas territories, where plantation economy depended on preventing successful flights to freedom. The journey would cover hundreds of miles through country where Joseph's race made him automatically suspect, and where being caught meant either immediate execution or return to slavery under conditions that would make his previous suffering seem merciful. Before departing, Joseph made final visit to the quarters where he'd lived with Hannah, retrieving the only possession that mattered, a wooden carving he'd made for her during their brief time together before Blackwood Fields destroyed everything except his memory of who she'd been before slavery and grief killed her. The carving was small enough to carry, precious enough to risk his life protecting. Abigail was awake when Joseph passed her cabin, her presence at the window not coincidental but deliberate witnessing of his departure. No words were exchanged, but her slight nod acknowledged both his actions and the consequences that would follow whether his escape succeeded or failed. She would be among those questioned about Knight's disappearance, her answers carefully calibrated to protect herself, while honoring the truth of what had driven Joseph to actions that would either make him free or make him legend. The discovery of Mackenzie Knight's body 3 days later triggered investigation that exposed the sophisticated brutality underlying Blackwood Fields' impressive cotton production, revealing systematic cruelty that even neighboring plantation owners privately acknowledged exceeded acceptable standards for managing enslaved labor in 1852 Texas. Miles Abbott's initial response focused on economic rather than moral implications. His primary concern centered on preventing the incident from disrupting operations during crucial harvest period, when cotton prices were optimal and delays could cost thousands of dollars in lost revenue. His questions about Knight's death emphasized practical matters: how quickly a replacement overseer could be hired, whether the murder would inspire resistance among other enslaved workers, and what measures were needed to prevent similar incidents. The inspection of Knight's body revealed details that transformed initial assumptions about spontaneous violence into understanding that his death had been carefully planned and executed by someone possessing both intelligence and determination that plantation ideology insisted enslaved people couldn't develop. The cotton packing, the structural engineering of the tomb, and the symbolic placement of Knight's whip all suggested sophistication that challenged fundamental beliefs about the capacity of people Abbott considered property rather than persons. County Sheriff Parker Grant arrived at Blackwood Fields on August 17, to conduct investigation that was required by law but constrained by social realities that made justice for murdered overseers far more important than justice for enslaved people who died under any circumstances. His examination of the crime scene produced admiration for the killer's technical skill that Grant was careful not to express publicly. Official report, Sheriff Parker Grant, August 18, 1852, Overseer Knight, murdered by enslaved worker Joseph Taylor through method demonstrating premeditation and calculated cruelty. Body discovered in cotton storage barn, suffocated within bales arranged to conceal crime while ensuring prolonged death. Suspect fled plantation, current whereabouts unknown. Recommend maximum effort for apprehension and public execution to deter similar incidents. The investigation revealed that Knight's death was only the most dramatic example of violence simmering beneath Blackwood Fields' profitable operations. Interviews with enslaved workers, conducted under threat of punishment for withholding information, exposed systematic brutality that had been building toward explosive release for years before Joseph provided the spark that ignited accumulated resentments. Abigail's testimony, carefully worded to avoid implicating herself while providing information that might reduce pressure on other workers, described Knight's escalating cruelty during months preceding his death. Her account included details about the manufactured quota deficiency that had triggered the August 11th whipping, information that several witnesses confirmed despite understanding that their honesty might result in punishment for having witnessed overseer misconduct without reporting it. The revelation that Knight had deliberately sabotaged Joseph's cotton sack created uncomfortable questions about whether the murder represented pure criminality or response to provocation that might be understandable even if not legally justified. Abbott moved quickly to suppress this narrative, insisting that enslaved people had no right to respond violently to discipline, regardless of whether that discipline was fairly administered. But the information had already spread beyond Blackwood Fields through networks of communication between plantations that allowed enslaved people to share intelligence about conditions, overseer behavior, and opportunities for resistance. Joseph's actions were being discussed across eastern Texas, his method analyzed, and his motivation debated by people who understood the desperation that could transform someone into killer of his oppressor. The economic impact of Knight's death extended beyond immediate disruption of harvest operations. News of the murder had reduced the value of Blackwood Fields as investment property, potential buyers calculating that a plantation where enslaved workers killed overseers represented greater risk than properties where control seemed more secure. Abbott's wealth, derived entirely from cotton production using enslaved labor, was directly threatened by Joseph's demonstration that the system's violence could be reciprocated. Neighboring plantation owners gathered at Blackwood Fields in late August to discuss collective responses to the threat Joseph's escape represented. Their meeting revealed the fragility of plantation economy and the constant fear that governed relationships between people who owned other human beings and those who were owned. The discussion exposed philosophical divisions about optimal methods for managing enslaved populations. Some owners advocated for increased brutality to deter future resistance, while others argued that Knight's excessive cruelty had been counterproductive, and that more moderate approaches might reduce the likelihood of violent retaliation without sacrificing productivity. Minutes from plantation owners' meeting, August 24, 1852, unanimous agreement that Joseph Taylor's capture and public execution essential for maintaining order across regional plantations. Debate regarding optimal management practices produced no consensus. Some members advocate enhanced security measures and more severe punishments for minor infractions. Others suggest Knight's methods were unnecessarily provocative and recommend more calculated approaches to discipline that minimize risk of inspiring resistance. The manhunt for Joseph had mobilized resources across multiple counties, with slave catchers offered substantial rewards for his capture alive or dead. The pursuit was framed as necessary response to criminal act, but underlying motivation reflected plantation owners' terror that Joseph's successful escape might inspire others to conclude that freedom was achievable through violence that had previously seemed unthinkable. Professional slave catchers who specialized in tracking fugitives had been hired at considerable expense, their services justified by Abbott's argument that allowing Joseph to remain free would cost more in long-term security expenses than the immediate price of his capture. These hunters used dogs bred specifically for tracking humans, their methods including torture of captured suspects, to extract information about escape routes and destinations. The search had been complicated by Joseph's apparent sophistication in covering his trail, his movements suggesting familiarity with evasion techniques that most enslaved people never had opportunity to learn. The slave catchers' frustration grew as days passed without substantial leads, their failure raising disturbing questions about whether their quarry possessed capabilities that challenged assumptions about the limitations of people who'd spent their lives in bondage. Reports from various sources suggested Joseph had been spotted moving south, his direction confirming suspicions that he was attempting to reach Mexico, where legal protections for fugitive enslaved people made permanent escape more feasible than in United States territories. The Mexican border was approximately 200 miles from Blackwood Fields, a distance that could be covered in 2 weeks by someone traveling at night and hiding during daylight hours. Bays. The psychological impact of Joseph's escape extended far beyond immediate security concerns. Enslaved people throughout eastern Texas were discussing the incident in whispers that plantation owners couldn't entirely suppress, their conversations revealing dangerous hope that one person's successful resistance might indicate broader possibilities for challenging the system that controlled every aspect of their lives. Abbott had responded by implementing enhanced security measures at Blackwood Fields, including additional overseers, more frequent inspections of quarters, and punishments for any behavior that might indicate planning or coordination among enslaved workers. The measures were expensive and reduced productivity, their necessity revealing the hidden costs of maintaining social order through systematic brutality. The new head overseer, Cole Freeman, had been hired from a Mississippi plantation known for harsh discipline. His arrival came with instructions to restore control without repeating Knight's mistakes, a contradictory mandate that reflected Abbott's confusion about whether the problem had been excessive cruelty or insufficient severity. Freeman's challenge was developing methods that would terrorize workers into submission without pushing anyone else past the breaking point where death became preferable to continued suffering. The cotton harvest continued despite the disruption, enslaved workers laboring under even closer supervision than Knight had imposed. Their productivity had actually increased slightly, not because Freeman's methods were more effective, but because Joseph's actions had demonstrated that resistance was possible and that overseers could bleed and die like anyone else. The knowledge provided motivation that fear alone had never achieved, transforming work into preparation for possibilities that had previously seemed impossible. Joseph Taylor moved through the Texas wilderness like a ghost, haunting the landscape that had consumed 3 years of his life. His survival depended on skills learned during rare moments when plantation labor had taken him beyond Blackwood Fields' boundaries and allowed observation of terrain that now offered both sanctuary and deadly threat to someone traveling without proper supplies or legal protection. The first week of flight had been the most dangerous, pursuit teams and their tracking dogs close enough that Joseph could hear their calls echoing through the pine forests and across the open prairie that separated plantation territories from the wild country, where fugitives either found freedom or died trying. His wounded back had reopened during the initial desperate push to put distance between himself and the slave catchers, leaving a blood trail that the dogs followed with terrifying efficiency. Joseph had used every evasion technique he'd observed or heard described during whispered conversations in the slave quarters, crossing streams to break his scent trail, walking on rock surfaces that wouldn't hold footprints, and moving through areas where wild hogs and other animals would obscure human tracks with their own movements. The methods had bought him time, but couldn't eliminate the systematic pursuit that was being conducted with resources he couldn't match. The turning point had come on the 5th night when Joseph encountered a small community of escaped enslaved people living in hidden settlement deep within the Pine Barrens, their existence known only to the network of freedom seekers, who passed information through channels that plantation owners could never penetrate, despite their best efforts to suppress communication between properties. The settlement's leader was a woman named Lily Daniels who'd escaped from a Louisiana plantation 15 years earlier and had since helped dozens of fugitives reach Mexico or establish themselves in communities that existed in the margins between legal society and the wilderness, that offered concealment at the cost of constant vigilance. Her greeting had been cautious but not hostile. Her evaluation of Joseph focused on determining whether he was genuine fugitive or infiltrator, working for slave catchers who occasionally attempted to penetrate the hidden networks. Joseph's wounds and the determination visible in his face had convinced Lily of his legitimacy, though his story about killing an overseer had produced responses ranging from admiration to concern about whether his pursuit would draw attention that might compromise the settlement's security. The community's survival depended on remaining invisible to authorities whose interest in fugitive enslaved people intensified when violence against white plantation staff was involved. Edith Sauté, Lily Daniels' advice to new arrivals, passed down through generations of freedom seekers. The man who kills his master becomes legend, but also becomes target that draws hunters like blood draws sharks. Your choice is between being free and being famous, and you can't be both when plantation owners are offering rewards that would feed a family for years. The settlement provided Joseph with medical treatment that went far beyond Abigail's field medicine, their healer having acquired knowledge from both African traditional practices and techniques learned from sympathetic doctors who occasionally provided clandestine assistance to fugitive communities. The treatment of his back wounds was painful but effective, preventing the infections that killed many escaped enslaved people before they could reach destinations where healing and rest were possible. During his recovery, Joseph learned about the sophisticated network of resistance that existed beneath the surface of plantation society, a system of communication, mutual aid, and coordinated action that challenged everything he'd been taught about enslaved people being isolated and helpless against the overwhelming power of institutional slavery. The revelation transformed his understanding of both his own actions and their potential significance beyond personal revenge. The settlement included people who'd escaped from plantations across Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Mississippi, their collective knowledge creating comprehensive understanding of plantation operations, overseer behaviors, and vulnerability points that could be exploited by those desperate or brave enough to risk everything for freedom. Their conversations revealed that Joseph's killing of Knight was neither unprecedented nor isolated, but rather part of a pattern of violent resistance that plantation owners worked desperately to suppress through both physical retaliation and narrative control. Stories circulated through the settlement about other enslaved people who'd killed overseers, masters, or family members of plantation owners, their actions ranging from spontaneous violence born of immediate provocation to calculated campaigns that demonstrated planning capabilities that slavery's ideology insisted were impossible. Each story carried lessons about what had worked, what had failed, and what price had been paid for resistance regardless of its success or failure. Joseph's method of using cotton as murder weapon had generated particular interest because of its symbolic power and the technical sophistication it demonstrated. Several people in the settlement had suggested that his actions might inspire similar resistance on other plantations, where overseers ruled through fear that could be broken by proof that their authority was not absolute and their lives were not invulnerable to retaliation. But Lily had cautioned against romanticizing violence that would inevitably result in brutal retaliation against enslaved people who had nothing to do with specific acts of resistance. Her experience had taught her that individual killings of plantation staff rarely produced lasting improvements in conditions, and often resulted in collective punishments that destroyed more lives than they saved. The debate within the settlement revealed tensions between those who advocated for armed resistance against slavery and those who believed that survival and gradual accumulation of free communities offered better long-term prospects than violence that would trigger overwhelming military response from state authorities who would tolerate fugitive settlements but not organized insurrection. Joseph's position in these debates was complicated by his recognition that Knight's murder had been personal revenge rather than political action, though its consequences extended far beyond his individual motivation. His willingness to discuss both his reasons for killing Knight and his uncertainty about whether his actions had been justified earned him respect from people whose own experiences with slavery's brutality made judgment impossible. Settlement Council Minutes, August 1852. Joseph Taylor's arrival raises questions about our policy regarding fugitives who've committed violence against plantation staff. His presence increases risk of discovery, but his knowledge of recent plantation operations and pursuit methods could benefit community security. Consensus to provide temporary shelter while he recovers, then assist his journey to Mexico where his specific situation makes remaining in Texas territories too dangerous. Van Wheels. The decision to help Joseph continue his escape to Mexico had been reached after lengthy discussion about the risks and benefits of harboring someone whose pursuers were offering rewards substantial enough to tempt even people sympathetic to fugitive enslaved people. The settlement's security depended on trust, and introducing someone whose capture would bring glory and wealth to slave catchers created vulnerabilities that had destroyed other hidden communities. Joseph's preparation for the final leg of his journey to Mexico involved learning Spanish phrases that might prove useful, studying maps that showed routes through territory where Mexican patrols could provide protection from American slave catchers who officially respected international borders while frequently violating them in practice. The border was approximately 120 miles from the settlement, a distance that could be covered in a week by someone traveling carefully. Lily had provided Joseph with supplies, documents forged to suggest he was a free person traveling on legitimate business, and letters of introduction to contacts in Mexican border towns who assisted fugitives in establishing new lives beyond the reach of American slavery laws. The documents were sophisticated forgeries that had been created by settlement members who'd developed skills that challenged stereotypes about enslaved people lacking education or technical capabilities. The night before his departure, the settlement had gathered for ceremony that honored both Joseph's survival and the memory of Hannah, whose death had set in motion events that brought him to this community of people who'd chosen freedom over the security of submission. The ritual incorporated elements from African traditions, Christian practices, and innovations developed within fugitive communities that created new cultural forms from fragments of destroyed heritage. Joseph's final conversation with Lily had focused less on practical travel advice than on philosophical questions about the meaning of his actions and their relationship to broader struggles against slavery's dehumanization. Her perspective, shaped by 15 years of helping fugitives navigate paths to freedom, offered framework for understanding individual resistance as part of larger movement toward liberation that would eventually overwhelm the system despite its current apparent invincibility. Her parting words carried weight of experience that transformed simple advice into wisdom earned through years of survival in circumstances that destroyed most people who attempted what she'd accomplished. You killed one overseer, but the system that created him is still standing. Real freedom comes when we build something that doesn't need their permission to exist. Get to Mexico. Live the life they said you couldn't have. That's how you win. Joseph had departed the settlement before dawn, moving south through country that grew increasingly arid as he approached the border territories, where the ecology shifted from pine forests to the scrubland that characterized the transition between American and Mexican territories. Each mile brought him closer to the boundary line that separated slavery from freedom, though he understood that legal borders meant less than the determination of people on both sides who would either help or hinder his final escape. The slave catchers found Joseph's trail on September 3, 1852, their tracking dogs picking up his scent near a creek crossing where he'd paused to refill water containers, unaware that pursuit teams had been systematically searching grid patterns that would eventually intersect with any route toward the Mexican border. The discovery triggered coordinated response involving multiple hunting parties, whose collective resources transformed Joseph's careful evasion into desperate flight through terrain that offered diminishing opportunities for concealment. Matthew Moore led the primary pursuit team, his reputation as the most successful slave catcher in eastern Texas built on combinations of tracking skill, ruthless determination, and willingness to employ methods that more scrupulous hunters avoided. His compensation was calculated based on captured fugitives returned alive, though dead bodies qualified for reduced payments that still made the work profitable when targets proved difficult to take without lethal force. Moore's team included 6 experienced trackers and a pack of bloodhounds bred specifically for hunting humans. Their training focused on following scent trails across varied terrain while ignoring distractions from wild animals or deliberately placed false tracks. The dogs had been on Joseph's trail for 2 days, their relentless pursuit forcing him to abandon careful movement in favor of speed that would either carry him across the border before capture or exhaust him to the point where resistance became impossible. Hagrir. The final confrontation began at dawn on September 5 when Joseph reached the Rio Grande at a point where the river formed the boundary between Texas and Mexican territory. The crossing was approximately 50 yards of water that represented the difference between continued flight and potential sanctuary. Though Mexican authorities' protection of fugitive enslaved people was inconsistent and depended heavily on local officials' attitudes toward American requests for extradition. Joseph had waded into the river when Moore's team emerged from the scrubland behind him, their shouts mixing with the baying of dogs that had been held back to prevent them from attacking their quarry before the slave catchers could attempt to take him alive. The reward for Joseph's capture specified preference for live return to Blackwood Fields, where Miles Abbott intended to make his execution into public spectacle that would deter future resistance. Moore's call for surrender was ignored as Joseph continued moving toward the Mexican shore, his progress slowed by current that was stronger than expected and by exhaustion from 3 weeks of flight through country that had tested every survival skill he possessed. The slave catcher's second warning was accompanied by rifle fire aimed deliberately high, intended to frighten rather than injure someone whose value decreased significantly if his body was too damaged for public display. Testimony from Mexican witnesses, September 5, 1852. The man in the river continued forward despite the shots, his determination visible even from distance. The American hunters seemed unwilling to kill him while he remained in the water, perhaps because his body might be carried downstream and lost. They were shouting for him to return, but he never looked back, his focus entirely on reaching our shore where their authority ended. Joseph's progress toward the Mexican side had been agonizingly slow, each step fighting current that threatened to sweep him downstream into deeper water where drowning became more likely than capture. Moore's team had moved along the American shore, their position allowing them to intercept Joseph if he changed direction or was carried back toward Texas territory by the river's flow. The slave catchers' frustration had grown as Joseph approached the midpoint of the river crossing. The boundary line at which their legal authority to pursue became questionable, and their actions might trigger diplomatic complications between American and Mexican governments whose relationship was complicated by disputes over territory and sovereignty. Moore had made the decision to enter the water when Joseph was approximately 30 yards from the Mexican shore, his calculation that capturing the fugitive justified potential diplomatic issues, reflecting the substantial reward being offered and the symbolic importance of preventing successful escape by someone who'd killed a white overseer. 3 members of his team had followed, their weapons held above water as they moved to intercept Joseph before he could complete the crossing. The confrontation in the river had been brief but savage, Joseph's desperation giving him strength that his exhausted condition shouldn't have permitted. The wooden carving of Hannah that he'd carried from Blackwood Fields was lost in the struggle, its disappearance beneath the muddy water somehow more devastating than the physical violence that accompanied his capture. Moore's team had overwhelmed Joseph through numbers rather than superior individual capability, their combined weight dragging him beneath the surface in struggle that nearly resulted in multiple drownings before they managed to secure his hands and pull him back toward the Texas shore. Mexican officials watching from their side of the river had made no move to intervene, their passive observation suggesting either unwillingness to risk confrontation with American slave catchers or acknowledgement that Joseph had been captured before definitively entering Mexican territory. Joseph's return to Texas soil had been marked by beating that Moore later claimed was necessary to subdue a dangerous fugitive resisting lawful capture. The violence exceeded professional necessity, its severity suggesting personal anger at the difficulty Joseph had created, and perhaps unconscious recognition that the captive had come within yards of achieving freedom that would have cost the slave catchers their substantial reward. The journey back to Blackwood Fields took 6 days, Joseph transported in chains that prevented escape while allowing sufficient mobility for walking that eliminated the expense of wagon transport. The route deliberately passed through multiple plantation properties, where his capture was displayed to enslaved workers who needed to understand that resistance would be punished and that escape was ultimately impossible regardless of how far fugitives managed to flee. Word of Joseph's capture had preceded his arrival, spreading through the communication networks that connected enslaved communities across the region. The responses ranged from resignation to anger, with some people viewing his recapture as proof that resistance was futile, while others interpreted his weeks of freedom and near-successful escape as evidence that the system's control was less absolute than plantation owners claimed. Miles Abbott had prepared elaborate execution ceremony designed to maximize the deterrent effect of Joseph's punishment, while satisfying his personal desire for revenge against someone who'd killed his most effective overseer and disrupted plantation operations during crucial harvest period. The preparations included construction of special gallows, visible from the slave quarters, arrangements for attendance by enslaved people from neighboring plantations, and invitations to white community members whose presence would transform the execution into a social event. Joseph's final days at Blackwood Fields were spent in isolation that prevented communication with other enslaved workers who might be inspired by his defiance or sympathetic to his situation. The isolation was both physical and psychological, designed to break any remaining spirit before the public execution that Abbott intended to use as demonstration of absolute power over people he considered property rather than persons. Abigail had been forbidden from visiting Joseph. her request to provide spiritual comfort denied by Abbott, who wanted to ensure that no information about the condemned man's state of mind reached the broader enslaved community. The prohibition couldn't prevent her from standing where Joseph might see her during the brief periods when he was moved between confinement locations, her presence offering silent acknowledgement that his actions had meant something regardless of their ultimate outcome. The execution date was set for September 15, 10 days after Joseph's capture, and 3 weeks before the autumn harvest reached its peak intensity. The timing was deliberate, chosen to allow maximum attendance, while ensuring that the disruption wouldn't significantly impact cotton production during the period when every day of labor translated directly into profits that justified the plantation's existence. The gallows stood empty on the morning of September 15, 1852, its rope swaying in the wind that carried whispers of events that would never appear in official records, but would live forever in the stories passed down through generations of people who understood that some truths are too dangerous to document, but too important to forget. Joseph Taylor had died during the night preceding his scheduled execution, his body discovered in the locked cell where he'd been held under constant guard by overseers who swore no one had entered or left during their watch. The official explanation attributed his death to heart failure, brought on by the physical stresses of his flight and capture, a conclusion that satisfied legal requirements while avoiding questions about marks on his body that suggested violence rather than natural causes. Miles Abbott's response to Joseph's death revealed fury barely contained by the necessity of maintaining appearances before neighboring plantation owners who'd gathered to witness the public execution that was supposed to demonstrate absolute control over enslaved populations. The loss of his carefully planned spectacle represented both personal humiliation and missed opportunity to reinforce through ritualized violence the lessons he'd intended Joseph's death to teach. The private burial that replaced the public execution was conducted without ceremony in an unmarked grave located beyond the plantation boundaries, its location deliberately obscured to prevent the site from becoming a place where enslaved people might gather to honor someone Abbott considered a criminal rather than a victim of systematic oppression. The grave's anonymity was intended to erase Joseph from history, transforming his resistance into forgotten incident rather than inspiration for future acts of defiance. But erasure proved impossible despite Abbott's efforts to control the narrative surrounding both Knight's murder and Joseph's subsequent death. The stories spread through networks of communication that plantation owners could monitor but never completely suppress, each retelling adding details that may or may not have been factual, but served the larger purpose of preserving memory of resistance against forces that sought to make such resistance unthinkable. Oral history preserved in enslaved communities, recorded decades later. They said Joseph died of natural causes, but Abigail, who prepared his body for burial, counted 23 wounds that no falling heart could make. They beat him to death rather than hang in public, because they were afraid of what he might say from the gallows, afraid his words would plant seeds they couldn't dig up, no matter how deep they buried the truth. The investigation into Joseph's death was perfunctory, conducted by local authorities whose economic interests were tied directly to plantation operations, and whose interpretation of justice prioritized maintaining social order over determining actual causes of death for enslaved people whose legal status as property rather than persons. Complicated questions about whether crimes against them were even possible under existing law. Sheriff Parker Grant's final report concluded that Joseph had died from complications related to his capture and return journey, his weakened condition making him vulnerable to stress that proved fatal before the scheduled execution could be carried out. The findings satisfied official requirements while avoiding conclusions that might have created legal complications for Abbott or his overseers, whose treatment of Joseph during his final days remained carefully undocumented. Abigail's private testimony, shared only with trusted members of the enslaved community, told a different story about Joseph's final hours. Her account described a man who'd been systematically tortured by overseers, seeking revenge for Knight's death and information about the fugitive settlement that had sheltered him during his flight. The torture had continued until Joseph's body simply ceased functioning, his death arriving as release from suffering that exceeded even the brutality of the whipping that had precipitated his rebellion. The wooden carving of Hannah that Joseph had lost in the Rio Grande was never recovered, its disappearance beneath the muddy water symbolizing the countless losses and destroyed hopes that characterized enslaved people's experiences under a system designed to extract labor, while destroying everything that made life meaningful beyond mere survival. The carving's fate became part of the larger story, representing both what had been taken and what could never be returned. Blackwood Fields. Operations continued after Joseph's death, though the plantation's reputation had been permanently affected by events that revealed the violence underlying its profitable cotton production. Potential investors proved reluctant to purchase property where enslaved workers killed overseers, and where control seemed less absolute than plantation economy required for reliable returns on capital investment. Miles Abbott struggled financially in the years following 1852, his cotton yields remaining strong but his ability to secure credit diminishing as lenders factored security concerns into their risk calculations. The plantation was eventually sold in 1856 to buyers from Mississippi who believed they could restore profitability through management methods that Abbott's experience suggested were inadequate for controlling populations who'd witnessed resistance and understood that overseers could be killed. Cole Freeman, the overseer hired to replace Mackenzie Knight, lasted only 18 months at Blackwood Fields before requesting transfer to a different property. His departure was officially attributed to better opportunities elsewhere, but private correspondence revealed that he'd found the atmosphere at the plantation oppressive, and the enslaved workers, barely concealed hostility more unsettling than open defiance would have been. The enslaved community at Blackwood Fields developed subtle forms of resistance that were impossible to punish because they couldn't be definitively proven, their actions including minor sabotage of equipment, deliberate inefficiency in cotton processing, and communication networks that warned of overseer movements and allowed coordinated work slowdowns that reduced productivity while avoiding individual culpability. Abigail lived another 12 years after Joseph's death, her longevity remarkable, given the brutal conditions that typically shortened lives far beyond what disease or natural aging would have produced. She became the keeper of stories about Joseph and others who'd resisted slavery's dehumanization, her role as oral historian ensuring that memories of resistance survived, even when official records were destroyed or falsified to support narratives that portrayed enslaved people as content with their condition. Even Wade's historical records, Abigail Anderson's testimony recorded in 1867. Joseph Taylor wasn't no saint, and he wasn't no hero in the way white folks understand that word. He was just a man who'd been pushed past the point where living meant accepting things that killed your soul before they killed your body. What he'd done to that overseer was terrible. But what had been done to him and to all of us was worse, because it happened every day and people called it normal. The fugitive settlement that had sheltered Joseph continued operating until the Civil War disrupted plantation economy and made such hidden communities less necessary as enslaved people achieved freedom through Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation and the Union Army's advance through Confederate territories. Lily Daniels lived to see slavery's legal abolition, though she recognized that formal freedom didn't eliminate the systems of oppression that would persist through other means. The story of Joseph Taylor and Mackenzie Knight entered folklore that was shared among formerly enslaved people and their descendants, each generation interpreting the events according to their own experiences with racism and violence that continued long after slavery's formal end. The tale served multiple purposes: warning about the costs of resistance, inspiration for those considering their own acts of defiance, and reminder that oppression could be challenged even when success seemed impossible. Modern historians researching slavery in eastern Texas have found scattered references to the incident in plantation records, court documents, and personal correspondence, though official accounts consistently misrepresent the circumstances surrounding both Knight's death and Joseph's capture. The documentary evidence reveals more through its omissions and distortions than through what it explicitly states, the gaps in official narratives indicating truths too uncomfortable to acknowledge. The site of Blackwood Fields plantation is now abandoned farmland, its original structures long since collapsed or demolished. Local residents occasionally report finding artifacts that suggest the property's history, including iron shackles, pieces of cotton processing equipment, and fragments of wooden structures that might have been slave quarters. These discoveries prompt brief discussions about preserving the site as historical landmark, though such efforts typically fade when confronted with costs and controversies associated with commemorating places where systematic brutality occurred. The Rio Grande crossing where Joseph nearly achieved freedom has been altered by more than a century and a half of environmental changes and human development, its appearance today bearing no resemblance to the landscape he encountered in September 1852. But the river continues flowing along the border between nations, its waters still carrying stories of people who risked everything to cross from oppression into uncertain freedom. The unmarked grave where Joseph was buried has never been located, despite occasional efforts by historians and descendant communities interested in providing proper memorial for someone whose resistance against slavery took forms that made him simultaneously victim and perpetrator of violence that the system itself had created. His final resting place remains unknown, perhaps appropriately given that his significance lies less in physical remains than in the memory of actions that challenged fundamental assumptions about power and submission. Contemporary discussions about slavery's legacy often focus on institutional aspects of the system, while overlooking individual stories of resistance that reveal the human capacity for maintaining dignity and agency, even under circumstances designed to destroy both. Joseph Taylor's decision to kill Mackenzie Knight and his near-successful escape to Mexico demonstrate that enslaved people were neither passive victims nor simple heroes, but complex individuals making impossible choices under conditions that offered no good options. The cotton fields of eastern Texas still produce crops that contribute to global textile industries, though modern mechanization has eliminated the brutal hand labor that characterized plantation operations in 1852. The economic structures that profit from cotton production have evolved, but questions about exploitation and justice in agricultural supply chains remain relevant more than 170 years after Joseph buried an overseer in the crop he'd been whipped for not picking. What happened at Blackwood Fields matters not because it was unique, but because it represented patterns of violence and resistance that occurred throughout slavery's existence in North America. Every plantation had its own stories of brutality and defiance, most of them lost to historical record, because the people who experienced them lacked power to ensure their stories would be preserved and believed. Joseph Taylor's legacy exists in the spaces between official history and oral tradition, in the stories that formerly enslaved people told their descendants, and in the recognition that resistance took many forms, including violence that makes contemporary audiences uncomfortable, but which represented rational responses to systematic dehumanization that offered no peaceful paths to dignity or freedom. The gallows that stood empty on September 15, 1852 was eventually dismantled, its wood repurposed for other plantation structures. But the memory of what it represented, and what Joseph's death prevented it from accomplishing, survived in communities that understood the significance of one man's refusal to cooperate with spectacle, designed to terrorize people into permanent submission. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.